Welcome to Parallax. Parallax, the construction amidst eternal decay. Parallax, the portal to the edge of chaos. Parallax, poem and provocation.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I'm excited. I really enjoyed our conversation last week. I'm in the middle of editing it, and we'll get it up on on the tube so everyone can watch it. But I really enjoyed hearing more about your own life and how you write and how you create and what parallax is, and I think lots of similarities between you and I, like similar tone I sense, or a hum or something like that, or approach to things.
Yes, we're right brain folks, as we were talking about in the
Yeah,
before.
yeah,
I think we both approach things in a very gestalty kind of way, and then work towards the details,
yeah, absolutely.
rather than being very linear and constructive in how we do things.
Yeah,
Very lateral, perhaps.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Really bad sellers.
Hmm. So in the last, the conversation we had, you were sort of asking me questions, grilling me about my life. So if
Hmm.
with permission, would like to do that with you. So
Totally.
what's the story of Guy Sengstock?
The
Start at the
story of Guy
beginning.
Sengstock. Yeah. Well, I think, it's interesting because I think I was born in Chicago in 1972. My dad at the time you could say my dad was, he grew up in the 50s. He was a Vietnam vet. He was in the Air Force. He wasn't like on the ground or anything. You didn't really see any fighting, but he lived in that era. And
Mm,
his both his parents were alcoholics. His mom was really, like, I think, physically abusive with him and his other brothers, but especially with him. And he was the youngest of three brothers. And I think that sense is like he experienced a lot of humiliation in that, right? Which developed in a kind of, if I were to be clinical about it, kind of like a kind of a big narcissistic wound, um, which led
mm,
to a lot of rage. And my mom, who grew up in Hinsdale, Illinois, she's, was born, my grandfather, who I spent a lot of time with, was kind of raised to be this, I don't know, this kind of perfect uh, nurse to Marquette. And then my mom and dad meet. My dad at this point was discharged from from Vietnam, went right into the protest, became a total hippie, and shows up at my grandfather's door, right, with two bottles, as he says, two bottles of Gold Duck in his hand,
mm,
and says, "Is Carol home?" Right? They get together, and what the story is like my dad basically introduced my mom to hallucinogens. So the first like 40 days they dropped together, right? And it was, my mom was a very kind of a princess, had a princess kind of, was raised a little bit like that. And
mm,
so she got swept up in that, right? And I think she ended up in both of them, um, struggled with addiction. I mean, they're both incredible people. Like, they're both amazing people. And they struggle with alcoholism and drug addiction and all the craziness that went with that. And I would
mm,
say that my mom, my dad would go into these blackouts, right? And get really, really violent, right? And so I would be kind of refereeing fights when I was a little kid between them, and just basically kind of saving my mom's life. And I think my mom understood a situation that she kind of was blindsided in, right? Like,
mm.
she's in an era, this is like the 1970s in Midwestern,
Yeah, the rules were not the same as they are today.
yeah.
Yeah,
She didn't talk about stuff
yeah.
like now, right? And so I think she was trapped inside of a marriage that she had no comprehension how to deal with. So she basically turned to me, right? In a certain sense, there was this kind of insulated kind of world that we were in together that was really, really difficult. So I
Mm.
was, I was kind of the savior in some sense, right? But yet couldn't save her. And she was dependent on me in some sense. And that really kind of like created some weird dynamics inside of me and future relationships and all kinds of things.
Mm. Mhm.
Um,
Well, that makes sense that your mission in life would be helping people communicate in their darker,
yeah,
not just their darker moments, but in their unconsciousness, and helping people find out, you know, articulate what matters to them, or ways
yeah,
to navigate
yeah,
reality. Uh-huh.
yeah. I think you're right on there because in a certain sense, like being around, like with my dad, the dynamic was, it's like anything at all. If the wind blew right in a certain direction, that would indicate that he was possibly wrong.
Hmm.
Attack, right? So there was I think a tremendous amount of hurt like inside him, right? That he had no way of dealing with, right? And so I would just be, I think I felt kind of emotional attunement out of survival. I remember being able to like tell what kind of mood he was in by the way he pulled into the driveway, right? When he got home, right? So
Hmm.
there was always this kind of strange sense of having some like awareness of emotional attunement, right? Out of a kind of a sense of survival. And it's
Hmm.
funny because somebody was asking me this again. We had one of the things I do is train people in the art of circling, in
Yeah.
this approach. And as we were at our level 2 program, and somehow we got to talking about this, and someone said like, God, it seems like you're doing that as like a way to control reality. And it was really interesting because I was like, you know what? It's more like I knew I had no control, right? It's more like it's like, if anything, it was a way of being really open and really flexible, like, because my dad was so unpredictable in a certain sense, right? So it was a strange way that I think created a kind of openness and a flexibility inside of me, that may have something to do with my temperament, right? Like somebody else may have got really like bit down and had to get super controlling, but I ended up really, really, you know, openly feeling into like what was happening, knowing I didn't have any control, but all I could do is have a certain response to it. And so from a real early age, I think I was set up like that, an adaptive nature.
Hmm. So I was
And I
thinking
think,
about how your parents got introduced to each other, and you said they did you said they did LSD or something together, right? Is that what you said, or was it just alcohol? So that
LSD, all of it.
everything they did everything, but
Yeah,
LSD kind of opens up the can of worms, the Pandora's box. It seems that it opens up a lot of things, and yeah, I wonder if that had something to do with it. It's like because just interesting thing, and I was thinking about you talking about openness and extreme attunement to different dimensions of reality and what's happening, and being very,
yeah,
very, because your survival depends on it, and yeah, that's
yeah,
remarkable. To that's
yeah,
And also I was also it reminded me kind of like how you develop your superpowers under extreme duress, often, and in crisis, or in terror. Like we kind of develop extreme adaptability.
yeah,
Mm.
totally. And I think in times what ends up happening, right? And I think this is the case with me is we develop these kind of adaptations, right? Are
Mm.
usually out of fear, right? Some kind of, you know, avoidance strategy or some kind of control strategy or something like that.
Yeah.
But those like mental, emotional ways of organizing, right? When we grow up, what can happen is like instead of those things being fueled by fear, they can be fueled by love, and they turn into these enormous works of art, right, out of those very capacities. And I think that's really a lot of what happened for me and is expressed in through circling. And I think it's the case with a lot of people, right? There's like a lot of gifts come out of those kind of weird, growths, street growths that like come out of these kind of really awful situations. Their survival.
Sure.
And
Well,
you
shocks,
start
right?
to love
Really.
those. Yes.
There's a bit of latency, so I just lost the last thing you said, but I was thinking about shocks. Gurdjieff talks about shocks, the shock.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. The
so,
sudden shock of the realization of separation.
hmm.
Yeah.
So you said, you developed this art of circling, and you went to art school, and you also described circling as an art. Maybe, um,
Yeah.
I guess we're jumping ahead if I was going to ask you about your story, but maybe art. Maybe we could talk about your art and what art
Yeah.
means to you, and because then you went to art school and
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think well, I'd always been a drawer. Um, since I was like a little kid. My dad did a lot of sketching. My dad's really creative, in that way. And I picked up on that. And so I always had a sketchbook, right? I was always drawing. I was always bugging my dad to teach me how different kinds of things, right? Um, I would like had a huge imagination. Like I couldn't, as we were talking about, they couldn't teach me to read until I was like 11. I had all the learning disorders and dyslexia, which actually I think was really what was happening. Is as we were talking before we pressed the record button, um, I just was super right brained, right? Like, and it's funny because I would go into these worlds of my imagination, and I would act them out, right? Like I, whatever I was into at the time, I'd act out these whole scenes, right, of sports scenes. And like I used to like when I got into sports, I would invent whole like world football leagues in my imagination, and then I would like be in my room, and I was an only child, right? So I basically was entertaining myself. I would I would imagine through the games play by play and write down all the stats, right? Right,
Hmm.
that kind of level of imagination. Um, and I was put in a special ed because no one could get me out of my imagination, right? And it's so interesting about like all of that because since I've had children,
Hmm.
my son basically just revealed to me that a couple of years ago that he did the same thing, right? He did the exact same thing where he does that imagination thing where he enacts whole world football leagues in his head
Oh,
and did
wow.
the exact same thing, but he was even more meticulous about it, right? So there's something through having kids, I realized like there's something genetic going on with that, or some kind of fundamental constitution that kind of comes through. It's been fascinating to watch having kids.
Yeah.
3-year-old, I'm seeing the same thing. Yeah,
Yeah, well, I guess, the journey from your father's sort of attunement, which you didn't have an outlet for, and then yours, which you discovered an outlet for, and now your son's, it's an interesting to think of that as a lineage, and
yeah,
um often
yeah,
maybe it gives you hope that these lineages can recover themselves on some level
yeah.
after all this
Totally,
trauma. The trauma
totally.
turns to something more life positive and creative and all of that.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And a big part of this actually was when my parents got sober, right? That was probably the biggest gift that they ever gave me, in a sense,
Mm,
right? In a very real sense. It also, interestingly enough, created a kind of crisis that ended up, I think, being the crack in me that opened me up to much higher or deeper things inside of myself. Because part part of my story was my grandfather. I would imagine both my grandparents kind of sensed what was happening, right? And my father basically, of all the cousins and aunts and uncles, he kind of just chose me, and
Mm-hmm.
he just poured himself into me. And he would pick me up from school, right? My parents weren't the most responsible, in the world. And so he'd pick me up from school, and I spent a lot of time with him. And my grandfather had an enormous sense of wonder and curiosity. And uh, he basically would just let me, he was just let me roam in his acre yard. He would tell me all these stories. He was born in Hanover, Germany. He was like apprentice as a tailor. He came over to the United States in 1927 with 50 cents in his pocket, as he used to say, and he started Hoff Cleaners um, in Hinsdale, Illinois, which ended up being a pretty famous high-end dry cleaners. And he was one of the top amateur photographers in the world. He was famous for giving these slideshows, right? When he would go
Wow.
on these trips, he was the first one to go into the Amazon and record a tiger fight, right? That was one of of his things. So he's really an exploratory of like incredible man, and he
Mm.
really poured himself into me. And I think what he did, right, was nurture a sense of wonder in me, right? That I think was really crucial. And my grandparents were kind of like the one safe spot in the universe.
Yeah.
So when my
Mm.
parents hit bottom and got sober, they recognized that they couldn't stay sober in Chicago, and so they moved to Cottonwood, Arizona, across
Wow.
the world, right?
Yeah.
Um, and really got involved in AA and 12 step things, right? And
Mhm.
I remember the move, right? My mom went into a treatment center to get sober, and and right during that time, right, right when she got out, we got in our little station wagon. We had taken over. Before that, we had my parents taken over the family business, Hoff Cleaners, right? My grandparents, and they basically, and this is in the early '80s, so basically snorted the business away, right? My mom didn't pay like income taxes for I think 4 years.
Yeah.
Business that was making $500,000, you know, profit in the early '80s. And so, the IRS took over, made them sell it and took all the money. And we went from like a high, upper middle class lifestyle, driving Rivieras, losing everything, driving an old station wagon with me and my cat and my dog and my two crazy parents,
You went out
newly so
west. Yeah.
right, and went out west. And I didn't really understand what was happening at the time, but for me, I experienced a break in reality, right? Because
Mm.
I think looking back on it, it's like leaving my grandparents, and they were kind of like the one safe place in the universe for me. And so
Uh,
I experienced this kind of bottom dropping out like experience at 12 years old, this kind of existential
mm.
um terror, right? And I would have these anxiety attacks, and I would just start crying, and I couldn't explain why I was crying, and I didn't feel safe with my parents to talk about it, and I didn't understand what was happening, and so it was really a moment of, I remember a moment of extreme chaos, right, in my world, and I had no comprehension of how to even articulate it or what was happening.
Mm.
And I would say that, and I remember this precisely because I think this is what kind of opened up for me is when we moved to Arizona, my parents got really involved in AA and in 12 programs and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And I think it was, I remember a moment where I think it was either they were having an AA meeting on our front porch, or there was just a bunch of their new friends in AA on, like
Mhm.
just talking. And they were having a conversation, right? That was a different conversation. And it's funny, like I totally recognized this, right? At the time, I distinctly remember this. They were having a different level of conversation that I'd heard, right? And I think up
You mean they
until
were
that,
getting real, or do you
yeah,
mean,
they're getting real.
yeah.
Yeah, they're
Mm.
getting real. Like up until that moment, all the conversations I've ever heard were basically kind of idle talk, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the Midwest. I mean, the Midwest can talk. The last time I was visiting my aunt, she talked about the Kirby vacuum cleaner for 3 hours, right? Like
Okay,
the
okay.
right this kind
Mm.
of
Is that just the landscape is so wide open and flat and dull that
what it
you
is
have to
about the
fill
Midwest.
it with conversation of anything whatsoever? And then the
Yeah,
cold
yeah,
winters and
logistics. Yeah, I
uh,
talk about logistics, and this just got kind of idling, as they would call it. It's like
uh,
most of the
mm,
time. But I was actually hearing people talk about, right, not not what they saw or what people said or what they were doing, but what had them do what they did. They felt about it, right? Like what was at stake about it. And I
mm,
remember that conversation as being a kind of completely different reality. Like it was its own world, right? And I distinctly remember that world opening up, and I could feel that whatever they were talking about in that world was somehow connected to this bottom dropping out sensation in my stomach. Some connection between the two, right? The world they were opening up and the world that was opening up in me in this kind of crisis were connected somehow. And so at I think 11 or 12 years old, entered into that conversation, and I basically come out since.
mm, mm. Yeah. So your orientation is what the fuck is going on here?
Yeah,
And what matters and what
yeah,
what's the meaning of all this?
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. It's
that's
like
very
what
interesting.
I think the sense was is like when that sudden loss of, moving away from my grandparents, the kind of loss of a sense of reality, right? Of
Mhm.
significance, that was implicit, right, in my relationship with them and their relationship with me. The loss of that, right, opened up the ground as such, right? And I sense that, there's a lot of people that go through AA who are incredibly wise people, right? Who have
Mhm, mhm.
kind of almost, most of them have almost died, right? And so there's this deep kind of wisdom and humility that comes out of a lot of them. Um, and so there was something about that there was something about that you could have a conversation and a way of relation that can orient or reveal this ground in some
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
And 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 that was like that was my intuitive sense, like in the beginning, I think, is like, oh yeah, conversation and relationship can be this deep kind of orientation to what's most significant and can reveal it in a certain
Yeah.
sense.
That's what I think why I'm doing this, with you and all these people. It's
Yeah,
because you reach a level of understanding where you're just bored with this kind of the other kind of conversation, right? You can't do it
yeah,
anymore. At least I can't do it. I mean, I guess I could do it for a little while. I could make sort of chit chat about things just to be friendly and kind but then in a few minutes, I feel like I'm at, I'm wasting my life or something. So if I'm not if I'm not in a field of meaning,
yeah,
I feel like I'm
yeah,
wasting my life. But I think that's because I got hurt somewhere down the line, and I no longer had faith in the world as it just appeared to me to be, just
yeah,
like what
yeah,
the world just appears to be.
totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah. And that recognition, those recognitions of that appearance, that there's could be a gap between appearance and the reality of it.
It's a
It's
shock.
a
Yeah.
trippy shock, right? It's such a
Yes.
trippy shock that I would imagine happens hopefully for everybody at some point, right? Where they kind of get a sense of that. I know that a
Mm.
lot of the traditions and some of the Western mystical traditions really, in some sense, you there on purpose in a certain way.
Yeah, it's conscious, but I think in a secular society, it usually happens unconsciously,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
There's no rites of going through, the underworld or whatever you need to go through. There's no one guiding you through it, which is why I think why the society is, that's the meaning crisis, right?
Yeah.
Is a lack of those rites of initiation and a lack of a conscious process of
Yes.
looking at maybe death, maybe because maybe that's what got your parents
Yeah.
the AA and
Yeah.
you know.
Totally. Yeah. Totally.
You said your
Yeah.
parents were amazing people, and so far you've just described them, in their worst moments, as
Yeah.
parents who were neglecting their child and not very present,
Yeah.
and then you needing to go with your grandfather. Um, did you find that out later? I mean, kids always love their parents no matter what they're doing.
Oh, totally.
But did you find out what was great about them later, or did they stick together and were they able to make it through that? Or
Yeah, they made it. They made it until I think I was 18 or 19, right?
okay,
And then they
okay,
split up.
okay.
My mom actually went back with her high school sweetheart, um, and married
Mm.
him and had an amazing
Uh-huh.
relationship, right? Until she died, which was about a year ago. Um,
Wow.
yeah, I I would say yeah, especially as I've gotten older, I've realized more and more, right, how incredible both my parents are. In a certain sense, my mom, I think from my mom, I had this experience I don't know, about 5 years ago or so, where just her, she came out and visited me in California. And and it was interesting because it was the first time that just her and I, right, got to spend time together in a long, long time. And because usually it's around family and,
Yeah.
other people. And so we sunk in together, right? And I remember she spent a week with me, and I'd get up and I'd like, so is there anything you want to do? And she'd be, not really. Let's just hang out, right? And so most of what we did was just sit down and we just read together, um, and just dwelled together. And
Hmm.
it was really interesting because I recognized something in that dwelling, right? I was like, oh yeah, there was something really deep happening in this place that my mom and I were deeply connected, right? It's like below language, below all of that, right? That I could feel, and it was like the sense of the familiar of the familiar. And I remember having this experience, like on one level, it kind of not that spectacular, but like inside of me it was incredible. Is we're we would I think we were reading, and then something a noise happened or something like that. Something happened in the environment, and I happened to be looking at her, and she just went. I just I saw her kind of pre-reflective response to the world. This sense of There was this kind of just this sense of openness, right, to something new, right? There was this kind of openness that she had, this welcoming sense, like open to being tickled by something, open to being struck or surprised by something. And it was so interesting, like seeing that, like just that fraction of responsiveness to the world. I recognized, I was like, oh my God, at some level, my whole life is owed to that.
Hmm.
Like I really got that from her, right? That sense of like openness, right, to things. And my mom was like, she was really artsy, and everyone loved my mom. Like everyone really, really loved my mom.
Mhm.
She was kooky. She had articles written about her because she was, her all of these iridescent like balls that she would have in her garden. She got like an article was written about her garden
Okay.
in Atlanta, and she made this yard. It became, like did that the last 10 years of her life, and she was kind of got semi-famous and doing these kind of strange, like kind of, you know goofy, eccentric little, you know things that she would put in her garden that she made, and then she would sell it like uh these festivals and stuff like that, and these collectors got into her art and things like that. And there was a kind of like just a neato-ness about my mom, and she really, really, I realized like, and I was able to tell her that, right? And I think she really got it because I think she felt really bad. I think she always felt like, with my mom, she always would talk about when she would see something in me that was really good or how my life turned out. She'd like, I don't know how you managed to do that. It was,
Mhm.
she didn't feel like she could take credit for any of that, right? And I was able to like kind of share that with her, and I think it healed something in her.
Yeah, something.
Right?
Mm.
It healed something in her.
Mm.
And then my
Oh,
dad
go
really
ahead.
kind of, in some sense, really came into his own in AA. He ended up. What I really saw in him is he really got into working with people and being of service with people. He sponsored so many people in AA and worked intimately with him. And he does have this. He's got this. He's really bright,
Yeah.
and he's got this sense of wonder about him as well. This kind of intellectual wonder. Um, and I think I really get some of that from him as well. And he's got this huge generosity. So it's there. There's a way in which something came through with my parents, that was, you know, which I now realize, like parenting, I think is parenting isn't just what it isn't just what you consciously think about you're doing when you're parenting. It's like
Oh, yeah.
right. There's something deeper going on there.
It's the overall transmission of your being
Yeah,
into that person, and
yeah,
even when you're, yeah. That's very interesting. Well, I was
yeah,
thinking about the question of addiction when you were talking because, I know a Buddhist master who I know said that his best students are all ex-AA, all have gone through intense addiction issues.
yeah,
And that passion and aggression, right? Um, if they can be tamed, are the greatest actually. So somebody who has a tendency towards violence, or somebody who has a tendency towards just sort of indulgence,
yeah,
intense indulgence, those are actually, that's like fuel for really
yeah,
good, let's say spiritual practice, tantric practice or whatever. Like that is the fuel. Whereas if you're
yeah,
just a person going along, if you don't have
yeah,
that, then you're not as likely to go the distance, or as Gurdjieff said, make the extreme effort. Like the extreme addiction leads to the extreme transformation, or something. I don't know, it's just a thought. What do you think about that?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think this orientation to extremes is huge. Is huge. Like, I think it's huge. And in some sense, the people who like you're right. In some sense, the people who are have addictions and struggle and like actually,
Or intense
confront the
trauma or
dysfunction.
something, like
Yeah, yeah. That it
really
kind of,
bad trauma, or
yeah, that it can simultaneously open you to all the things that are beyond, right, in some way, and
yeah.
dispose us that way. Yeah, yeah. It's like I think the way that John talks about, um,
That's so funny. I was just thinking of John as you were speaking, so we are synced. Oh,
yeah,
but please
yeah,
continue. I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah.
Well, the way that John Vervaeke talks about fiction as being a reciprocal, a relationship with
Hmm.
something where like it's a reciprocal closure, but there's also that same machinery, cognitive machinery that you use that happens in addiction is also there can be a reciprocal opening, right? That
Hmm.
you relate to something in such a way that the feedback of it like opens you more, that allows you to relate more deeply to what you're relating to, that opens more reciprocally, they anagogically open each other up in a big way. Um, and so there's something, the machinery of addiction and the machinery of realization, right?
Hmm.
In some senses are kind of the same machinery.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Hmm. Yeah, you mentioned John, and as you were speaking, I was thinking about he shared his a bit of his past, John Vervaeke, as being in a very narrow religious community, kind of, and
Yeah,
being disturbed by that, and then going out and being a professor and becoming a sort of highly functional, like brilliant professor, just of the mind, and now making the journey to the Silk Road, and to he's speaking about God these days, and so it's kind of that's kind of an interesting journey from you know from a smaller from the world being shattered, like the world of your grandparents, that world which seems so secure, and or the world of our ancestors, seeing that being shattered, and then this long process of of being in a real unknown unknown land,
yeah,
and then
yeah.
finding
Well,
something else. That's what the spiritual path is all about on some level.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I, it's funny. I was thinking about this with, that right now, anyways, there's this press about Musk, right? And how apparently he's got addictions and people are, his character is being deeply questioned of like, he's
Yeah.
chaotic, all this kind of stuff, right? And to me, I'm like, what else did you expect? Like, if you can have somebody that can is doing all the stuff he's doing, right? But just imagine the kind of extremes going on inside of
It's all
him, right?
doing too. Yeah. Mhm.
Like, of course, like it's kind of obvious that he's probably thunderstorms going on inside of him, right? Like
Yeah.
this, it seems to come to territory.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think about Gurdjieff a lot, and I'm also have this obsession with tarot cards. And the Chariot is the ultimate card of, worldly achievement, but it's limited. It's limited,
Yeah.
and then you have to go jump to the next level. So that's the lower cards. The first seven cards are about the world, and the next seven cards it also lines up with Gurdjieff's law of three. You have
Yeah.
the first stage of life is like mastering all the things of the world, education, school, getting a job, becoming successful, fully achieving that. And then there's going to be a breakdown at the end. That's where Musk is at right now, because he hasn't yet
Yeah.
approached the spiritual, dimension of existence particularly, right? He might have read Nietzsche or something, but I don't think he's even touched that, because if he did, maybe it would be a bit of a shock. But so
Yeah.
there's a shock between all these three, and the next level is sort of the religious life, and then the third level is like starts with the devil, starts with Beelzebub, and that's the higher level is a much higher dimension of the spiritual life. So there's these
Mm.
different stages of existence. The
Hmm.
first is getting grounded in the life. The second is, ethics and spirituality and religion and meaning and philosophy and all that. And then there's a third level of life, which I guess you would map it onto the more, cosmic or creative
Yeah.
or um,
Yeah.
less linear world, um,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is
Totally.
but between each of these stages, there's a shock. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Hmm. So I was thinking about your life, and I think about, so the shock came very early, which plummeted you up into this other realm of
Yeah,
investigation.
yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. And it was and then there was like more shocks, right? When I moved from Arizona to go to art school in San Francisco in my early 20s, right?
Yeah.
I had not like I had not experimented with any kind of drugs or anything like that. I mean, my parents were in AA sober and kind of like
Yeah.
that just was a part of my world. And then I moved to San Francisco and I start experiencing people that are even deeper than the people I was hanging out with in Arizona, but they were doing like LSD and mushrooms and all of this kind of stuff. It's the Bay Area.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then there was the world of that opened up, right? And that kind of like catapulted a whole other dimension of reality, right? That was on one level so familiar and so new at the same time, right? Like the
Just
world.
one question, if I may, before you go into the narrative about your San Francisco life. Did you ever get to a stage where you could have repeated your parents' addiction issues, where you could have where you were gone down that road?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think so. Yeah, I think so.
And
I
what
definitely.
protected you from not going down that road?
I basically at I basically took on. I, I essentially I got married and took on two little girls.
Yeah, yeah. That's my story as well. We have similar stories. Yes. Yeah, there you
Yeah,
go. Yeah.
yeah. Because there was a sense um like because I was in San Francisco, I was made friends with people that were with these raves, these outdoor raves. And, it was all during that time
Yeah.
of
The raves. Yeah. Yeah.
tribal communities is what they used to call them at the time, right? And
What did they call them? Sorry, I didn't get that.
urban in America they call them urban. I remember that the name was urban tribal communities was the name that was used a lot,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And there was these amazing parties, right? That and house music and all of that, right? And all of this kind of openness that was just amazing in a lot of respects. And it was through that it was through that I met. Well, it's not through that I met Jerry, but like I met Jerry, and Jerry kind of introduced me to a lot of that world.
Hmm.
And and Jerry was the guy that basically we were the two people that kind of took on the circling method when it first happened, right? Um, and
That was in the 90s
yeah, it was
sometime?
19, yeah, right around 1998.
1998. Hmm.
And yeah, and basically, kind of what happened was um, him and I took I remember I took my first like transformational course in San Francisco, well, actually in Oakland. It was a
Hmm.
um, it was a course for men with men, and I mean the course was interesting and stuff. But that's where I met him, and and that's where he started to now Jerry had been really involved in the whole human potential movement. Right? He had been taking courses.
Hmm.
He was really involved with like landmark education, Warner's organization. It used to be EST, then became Landmark. And in
Hmm.
the Bay Area, all of this language, right? All those words, everyone knows what that means, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like its own kind of culture of the human potential movement, and it's by Big Sur and all that kind of stuff. So Jerry was really a product of that, right? He really kind of came out of that world.
Hmm.
Uh, at one point he was kind of on training himself to be a forum leader in that organization, and then he had gotten his
And
girlfriend.
Essalon, is that what it is? Or something different?
No, something different. Yeah.
Something different.
So
Okay.
you could say est, est. back in the like started late 60s or early 70s was kind of the first, I don't know, really was the, like, if not the first, the one that really popularized this kind of this way of taking a course, going through a course and being transformed by it, right? That sense
Okay.
of, right, like Est was the first ones that kind of like had this, that particular style, if you will, of, where you go,
Changing your life.
yeah, changing your
Okay.
life, basically. Yeah, really.
Yeah.
And then the current iteration of Est was Landmark, and that's where Jerry kind of grew up in a lot of respects, right? He did a
Hmm.
lot of different,
Yeah.
and him and I got together and started becoming friends, and he and I didn't understand this at the time. What what he was kind of getting at exactly at the time, but he was really drawn to me. On one level, I scared him, right? Because like I was, I've been lifting weights since I was 11 years old. I at the time had this like goatee and I had like long spiral hair, like coming down to here. I was a trainer and a stripper and all this kind of stuff, right? Like going to art school full time. He didn't quite know what to make of me and he was quite intimidated by me. But he noticed like I had a way of articulating things
Hmm.
that he couldn't understand how I know how to do that in some sense, right?
Oh.
Like, and so he was drawn to me, and I was kind of drawn to him, but we didn't quite know why exactly. Um,
Hmm.
we started to like he started to introduce me to this world and the community of people in that world, and we started to have these experiences together. That were these profound, I would say, experience and relation with one another that weren't in the beginning, they weren't planned on, right? It wasn't like we all sat down and said, let's have an experience or let's develop a thing or something like that. It was more like, we would just start to open up to each other. And in particular, Jerry and I um, seemed to have an affinity to noticing what was happening. We're like, because I remember we'd have these experiences where of where people would be our friends, we would all relate to someone, and they'd have this experience of being deeply seen. It was almost like in this kind of profound way, right? And we'd see the beauty of someone, right? And then everyone was like thrown to like try to articulate what that was, in some deep sense. And there'd be these deeply emotional and really kind of almost cosmic experiences that were
So were these
happening.
just conversations or were they practices or, like, I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, people were doing other things in San Francisco, right? Like the San Francisco Zen Center and all the other things that
yeah,
were Sufism but it wasn't
yeah,
anything formal like that. It was just a few people
yeah.
getting together and something happening.
In the beginning, it wasn't formal at all, right? It
Uh-huh.
was we would just get together and we'd hang out and we'd fall into these kind of conversations that would like lead to these deep experiences, and it just kept happening. And then at a certain point, Jerry and I had this experience in 1998, and it was actually at Burlington, where we were walking around with kind of a group of friends that we were hanging out with at the time, and there was a conflict that basically happened in that group, and we all ended up, and this is a classic Burning Man story, right? That we all
Yeah,
ended
yeah.
up in this, way out into the playa, the middle of nowhere, in this kind of teepee fractal art thing. We just sat in a circle, and and I just got really interested in the conflict, and then through that interest in the conflict, evoked a conversation that left the level of the conflict, right, and started to reveal deep things going on with, one of the people, and like what ended up being revealed and like through that conversation was like basically this person's essence at some level felt like it got seen, right, by everybody. And then it went to the next person and the next person and the next person and the next person, this experience of like profoundly getting something deep in relationship about that person in a way that kind of changed all of us just by witnessing it.
Just a
And
question related to that. Is this with drugs or without drugs?
it
Or
was
is
in the
that
beginning, it was both. In the beginning, it was both.
it was both?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. In the beginning, it was both. And the after 12 in that particular experience, like that, like 12 hours went by and the sun's coming up, right? And Jerry and I remember Jerry and I walking away from that experience, and it was this kind of moment of truth, um, for both of us because we both kind of like looked at each other, and he pointed back to where we were, where we had that interaction, and I pointed back to it. We didn't have a word for it, but we just at the same time just brought our hands out and shook on it,
Something happened.
and something happened. Yeah,
Yeah.
and we just committed to it, and we didn't know exactly what we were committing to exactly, but whatever it was, we were going to like dedicate ourselves to it. And
That's
that was
amazing.
yeah, it was that conversation. Out of that conversation came, um, you know, courses and what later would be called, give it the name circling, right? And all kinds of things like came out of that 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 handshake that I had no idea was going to happen.
So where's this Jerry fellow these days?
He died. Yeah, he died about, I don't know, about 4 or 5 years ago, I think. Yeah,
Hmm. And you
yeah.
you work with him all the way through until his death?
We worked not all the way through. At some point, he kind of stopped. We kind of needed to go separate ways, right?
Hmm.
He had to take care of his family and do a bunch of things for himself.
Hmm.
But I would say that, like what started the very first iterations of circling were these 3 day experiences we would have. Um, and it was a course that we would put on. And it would be basically us, it would be 3 days of us, of anywhere between 8 and 16 people would show up at this kind of resort setting up in the woods in Northern California, and we would just circle. And and it was through that, and we do it about every 3 months. And it was really interesting because people would do that course, and then they would want to support the course, and then they would be on this, what we would call the production team or the source team.
Hmm.
And it is so interesting because the source at one point got so big. I remember one course that where there were like 8 participants and something like 60 people on the source team. Right? It was
Yeah, that's funny.
it was
Yeah.
like this, it was this real experience of communitas, I think, in a big
Yeah.
way. Um, that that was being experienced in and through that experience of circling. And it was amazing. It was really, really amazing. And then there was kind of and in the beginning, we didn't really like, I'd say what our focus was on the organization Arate in that course. But as time went on, I started realizing, like, for me, what was happening in circling, right? Which is this, you could say, this deep way or of having a genuine I thou encounter with somebody, right?
Hmm.
Like that the language that we had in the beginning, right? If we think about language as like, you can think about words as ways of touching something or ways of like
Hmm.
hands you can grab something with.
You mean your
And for me,
in-house language or like the language you had with each other that described
yeah,
it's
yeah,
sort of an
yeah. The only
operational
language,
language, but also a uh-huh.
yeah, the only language that we had in the beginning to grab hold of this experience that we were having that we ended up calling circling was like kind of human potential um, movement language, you know, self-improvement language, self-help language, like that kind of, you know, vocabulary and vernacular sensibility.
But it's not
And
exactly that, is it? It's something else.
no, and that was one of the things I was really tuned into, is that at some, like in a lot of ways, those hands could actually grab hold of what we were doing, right? But there was always for me this experience of like there's something there's a moreness, there's a there's a as William Desmond would maybe call it, a wooing of being. There was always there was some kind of excess from those experiences that language couldn't get hold of, and I always
Well, maybe that
remember.
language is too instrumental, you know,
Yeah,
because I
yeah,
think
exactly
something
right.
primordial about circling, right, is it's like the earliest thing ever people have ever done,
Yeah,
you know, in order to understand what's going on in the tribe and who we are, and it's so
yeah,
primordial that it's almost what develops civilization. I mean, I've never done formal circling, but I
yeah,
that you seem to be tapping into that, which is different than improving yourself, becoming a better person, blah blah blah. You know,
yeah,
it seems to
yeah,
me that's something different. It's um, hmm.
yeah,
I
totally.
was also thinking about how yeah, how psychology is so limited. Fundamentally, there's been a mistake of psychology, right? It's that it's about you. It's about fixing yourself. That
Yeah,
seems to be, it's
yeah,
like that's the biggest mistake of psychology in the late 20th century, early 21st century. Is that it's about fixing yourself.
totally,
That's a radical
totally. Yeah,
statement, but you know,
yeah, and indeed, even this notion of that self, right, is questionable. What is that
exactly, yeah.
self, right? At some
Because there is
level.
no, there's no, um, there's no self, the Buddhists would say, but also, but the self is a dynamic process, and so finding yourself is something you'll never find.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it was really interesting that dimension, that primordial sense, this kind of excess coming out of these experiences, this thing that we couldn't, it didn't feel like the language that we had was actually adequate for it. There's something really different. And that really struck me, and it drew me into it. And out of that is where I now realize, which is what had me start like reading people like Heidegger, right? And
Mm.
Merleau-Ponty and philosophy, and especially the phenomenologists. And I didn't kind of understand this at the time, but like I realize that now at some level, what I was seeking in that, right? Because I'd go to Barnes, I remember going to Barnes and Noble and trying to read Being in Time, having never read philosophy. I basically like
Yeah.
picked up the hardest book in philosophy to read. And I didn't understand a thing that was being said, but like there was something about it that had that same feeling that I think I was having in circling, like these something he's pointing at that drawing me to it. And it was really getting involved in like reading Heidegger and Gurdjieff, right? And then people like Torthang Tolku, right? And his work in being in his work in time, space, and knowledge, right? And that
Mhm.
those kinds of things. And then going to meditation retreats and uh, you know, like uh meditating and all of these things at
That
some
came
level.
later. That came later after after you've developed circling, and
Yeah,
it's kind of
yeah, like
interesting.
at the beginning, right? And then me trying to articulate what was happening, I think all like it drew me into all these things in order to to get the right hands to be able to grab hold of this thing that was happening with circling. And
Mhm.
that whole process, I would say was like for me was life changing, right? That was life changing in some sense. Like and for me, circling has been kind of fractal in that way. It's like it showed itself to me, right? And then me trying to understand it kind of like showed, it ended up showing me to me in a certain sense. It drew
Oh
things
yeah,
out of,
that's interesting.
right. And it's
Mhm.
like there was a real relationship and continues to be a real relationship with that is really at the bottom of it. Right. I would say that the the thing that makes the circling method and the circling approach um, what it is really about a deep attunement with wonder, right? It's and and that's the thing that I think that makes the circling method what it is, right? Is like it's really at the bottom of it. It's about wonder and this
Mhm.
and wondering, right, with each other, right, in the worlds that can open up and this kind of deep sense of intimacy that we have with one another. And circling really has developed into, I would say, a basic way of attuning, right? It's, you could say it's a communication or a way of communing, right? That really attunes to a kind of a, I would say, a poetic attunement versus like a technological attunement, right?
Mhm.
Of reality. And that attunement, that way of attuning, I think is the thing that really draws people to circle and to train to circle, right? This kind of more, this way of not looking at the world as a bunch of resources, right? That we optimize, like colonize and extract and instrumentalize through instrumental reason and all that kind of thing. But there's a way, there's a fundamental attunement that's more, as Heidegger would say, it was a more of a poetic attunement, right? Which is more of a, rather than a demanding force, the kind of nurturing force, the kind of midwifing, right, in
Yeah.
the Socratic sense of the word, and
Yeah.
developing a really deep sense of listening, right? And that's the, and at a certain point, once I started to kind of realize that, right, and we started
Mhm.
to realize that we're not actually we're not, like, circling isn't part of the, you could say the isn't another self-improvement project. It's not, it's not about personal growth, right? It's about this different attunement. It's
Yeah,
about
I
this,
get it.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
think that I was thinking, what I got from Heidegger when I read him, it was I sort of thought that philosophy was about, create generating concepts, ideas,
yeah,
making theories about reality. But what I understood from Heidegger, it's actually revealing something that's it's about uncovering something. It's about uncovering something that's there. And what you uncover is not necessarily it's not necessarily an explicit description of reality. What you
yeah,
uncover is sort of like an information packet which reveals itself over time. It doesn't like I remember Leonard Cohen saying when he writes a song he didn't really get it until playing it for 10 years, and then now he knows what the really
yeah,
what the or the song, like a good song deepens over time. It doesn't have a one-dimensional meaning. It's an evolving meaning. And so it sounds like that's what circling was. It was like a realization which didn't have a form or a name yet, and then it sort of developed itself over time, but it never stops developing, right?
totally, yeah, totally. And also through in and through the medium of human relationship, right, is is really what it happens through, is that there's a way, like Buber, I really like Buber's language about this, right? That he says, he would say that, life itself is a relation, right? Everything's a relationship, right?
Yeah.
And he said we're in his language, we're in one of two modes or one of two attitudes in how we have that relationship. We're either in an I it
Yeah.
relation or I thou relation. And he says both are spoken in one word. In other words, they happen together. There's no I out there and thou's out there or it's out there, and then they come and meet. It's, you have an I it relation or I thou relation. And he said, really in shortening this, he says, like, an I it relationship is where you relate to something as means to your own end, right? And in an I thou relation, you relate to that which you relate to as an end in itself, right?
Mhm.
And he says this is what's really interesting about what he says. He says, and the I of it is not the same I as the I of thou,
Yeah.
right? The I of it is not the same I as the I of thou. And
Well, I
it's
mean,
that,
that's the left and right brain too. I know Guy Sengstock as this person who is the head of the Circling Institute, and there's all of these categories that I put as a placeholder so that I can understand who is in, and then we have a podcast, and that's sort of instrumental. There's nothing wrong with
yeah,
it in particular, but then I'm not really seeing Guy. Sorry, I was Guy again. I'm not really seeing Guy necessarily. I'm not even seeing his face. I'm just, and then suddenly you see something, and you're like, the veil sort of drops and you see a
yeah,
person, and it has nothing to do with any of your ideas of who that person is or what that person is. You see the mystery, right, of
yeah,
being.
yeah. Very well said. And you
Yeah.
can notice that like when that veil drops, there's a different eye that beholds that veil, that veil being down, right? It's like this kind of it's not just an improvement or an alteration on something. It's a different mode, right? It's a different mode of being, right? As such. Um,
Mm.
and it's that I would say that like in some sense, in existential language, like here is really known for this where there's all these hyphens between words, right?
Yeah,
Be
yeah,
in the hyphens. And like hyphen, what the hyphen does is it basically says the reality, it's the relation, right? That's more real than the things. Like the things arise from the relation, right? The thing don't create the relation, they arise from the relation. And I would say circling is something like this entering into this I thou and in some sense like really being in the reality of the hyphen. It's like the hyphen is you can start to feel that relational nature, right, of the way things unfold. And in that sense, it's beyond relationship, right? It has these kind of mystical elements to them
yeah.
and these deeply human like elements to it all at the same time.
Mm. Yeah, and it's like it must be like a sort of. I mean, you could use the word seeing the divine or something, the thou or the divine, or
Yeah.
be that state is what we long for the most,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
what we're alienated from the most. Uh,
Exactly.
yeah,
And this is like speaking of the alienation, it took me, one of the things that was really interesting about circling is that I don't know, like within 10 years or something, circling was all over the world,
yeah.
right? It was like on multiple contexts, right? In continents. And I
Yeah.
was like, and I would say that that happened like in spite of the personalities, thyself included, right? Um, and I was always curious about like like what is actually going on there? And it took me years to kind of realize this, but I started to recognize that it certainly in some sense was an expression and a response to technology, essentially, and especially the internet,
Mhm.
right? And it's like it was birthed right and like at the heart of technology, Silicon Valley, right, and right
But
at
it's
the
a
beginning.
dialectic too. It's like
Yeah,
a yeah.
yeah.
Because as
And I
people become more mechanical, as they become more like Mechanical Man, bring back Gurdjieff, again, the more we need things that will wake us up from our sleepwalking mechanicalness,
yeah,
meditation,
yeah,
circling, et cetera, right?
yeah, absolutely. And and I think specifically, as far as I can tell, and I don't hear people talk about this that much, but this really intrigues me, is I think there was a really big thing that happened where when technology basically uncollapsed, um, communication from relation, or at least the two-way back and forth communication, the information exchange between two people got uncoupled from relationship. And for example, I think the first example of this was with the answering machine, right? Like you could call someone and leave a message, and they can call you back and leave a message on that, right? Like I think that was the first iteration of it.
Huh.
And then, right, and then the internet kind of like, put that on steroids, and so now I have apparently a personality out there that is having conversations with people that I don't know about online, in a certain sense, and I don't even know what to make of that. But what happens whenever you progress or technology uncouples anything, right? It ends up transforming us. And I think if you look at it like this, it's like,
but also
relationships.
Sorry, go ahead.
Relationships terrifying, right? Like.
Yeah.
Relationships have always been terrifying, right? Otherness.
Yeah.
There's like, when people go to therapy, it's usually not because of like trees or buildings, right? It's because of being fucked up by relationships, right? In some sense. So if I start to introduce the possibility of not having relation and still having communication, minus the relation, of course, my nervous system is just going to start going in that direction. And I've been doing some research on this lately, and I've recently found out that 100 years ago, if you look at this, 100 years ago, there was the average person would have somewhere between 35 and 45 conversations a day, and now we have 5 a day on average.
You mean with real people in the street, in the market, in the store?
Or like on the phone, it has to be live, right? The coordination, right? Where you're confronting otherness, essentially, right? Coordinating that.
We don't confront otherness except the virtual otherness, and and this is what you would be. This is why it's so scary what's happening to young people, because they don't need to have a social life. They can have a virtual social life, so they get very isolated. They always have something to fill that anxiety that you would experience, and so we need it is rather. But then the anecdote arises from the the pathology. So circling, I was thinking also McLuhan says that when something like his tetrad analysis, if something is invented, then something is retrieved from the past that has been lost. And I can imagine that circling was how people did government before. I mean, it must have been how if you look at a bunch of native people, they sit around and someone speaks when their heart calls them to speak. They don't have these sort of ridiculous conceptual conversations, battles, in public. They would get a little bit meditative and speak, or they would invite the truth to arise in the moment, in that moment. I mean, that's just wisdom, right? So it seems like circling is just it's
totally.
It's almost obvious, but then it's interesting that you rediscovered it in a way, right? Or something.
Yeah, it's interesting. And even even the fact we couldn't really, even though we tried just pre-reflectively to fit it into this kind of human potential self-improvement project, it just wouldn't do it, right? And kind of years later, I realized, oh, okay, this starts to make sense, because you could say that circling is a way of, when you do a circling session, right, and bring it into some kind of form of practicing the circling method, right? Essentially, what you're doing is you can almost look at it as something like it feels like you're doing a yoga of relation, right? You're really, really doing these deep asanas, right? In these like very concrete skills of ways of listening, ways of paying attention, ways of speaking, ways of wondering, right? And it's like it's very much like a dojo or a
Mhm.
way of concentrating, like a gym, like the way a gym is a weird thing where it basically like intensifies gravity and you go in there and move, right? In some sense, when you practice the circling method and you do like a circling session, like with a group of people, you could almost look at it as like a gym or a dojo of intimacy, right? In that
Mhm.
way. Um, and I now realize that, oh, okay, like we circling was a response to actually what was happening in our time, right? Where people, I think, were, without even knowing it, right, were drawn to circle into the circling method, and we were drawn to like really articulate it and in some sense make it teachable, right?
Mhm.
Out of this recognition that the that with the downfall or the loss of the other, and therefore the loss of relation being given by the culture, that there was a
Yeah.
way to at least deepen the quality of the relationships that we do have, right? And that essentially is what my understanding of the circling method is now.
Mm. Yeah, that's wonderful. That's amazing. And it seems to me that it's just obvious, right? That is,
Yeah,
that's what we should do when we communicate with each other. So,
yeah,
it seems like you've discovered a primordial skill that, so if there's a future school, that they would teach that, right? It would just be obvious that that's what they teach. In fact, I guess people are sort of, in schools you have people good to get. Everybody used to be at little desks and like rows, and now everybody's in little
yeah,
circles. So
yeah,
it's kind of funny how it's
yeah,
true. I teach at schools, and they don't make the desks in rows anymore. They make them in circles. It has
yeah,
another issue to it, but again, it seems like an obvious thing, and also it seems like something that's must exist in all religions throughout history in some way or another, right? So,
yeah. Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And especially if you think about, how do human beings become people or persons, right? It's in and through other people, right? Like it's always been the case with human beings, right? Like you
yeah,
having a 3-year old and rewatching this all again. It's this this child is swimming in the inner subjectivity of with his mother, with me, with his grandparents, right, with his teachers. He doesn't even have a notion of himself, right, at this point. He's just people are responding to him and he's co-responding, and how that response goes is telling him things about that there's even a him. And by the
mhm,
time his brain is able to like fold back on itself and say I, that which he folds back on to say I will be a complete donation of the relationships from the relationships in his life. And I think that it's it's hard to kind of like Heidegger said that the most obscure or the most mysterious, what's most near, it's hard to recognize like how we are like human beings are don't make any sense outside of relationship, right? It's in and through relation that we become people. And I think
that
it's
we become
that's
souls, like in a way, right?
yeah,
That we
yeah,
have a
absolutely,
soul. I think the soullessness of the society is the atomatization and the soullessness that you see in modernity in general, right? Is a result of that fragmentation, that process being somehow arrested,
yeah,
and manipulated, and we lose the thou, so to speak, right?
yeah,
Um, so,
absolutely,
but yeah, that's so interesting that a child would be learning this, and that this is actually what adults have to keep doing as well, because the process it's not a process that has an end to it. There's no end to that.
Exactly.
relational process. There's no beginning really. It just, I guess, birth. But even before that,
Yeah.
even before birth, there's circling, of, you know,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
very interesting.
Totally. And it's, if you think about technology, if you look at what technology does, the spirit is like, as Heidegger talked about, like we're in an age of technology, right? It's not, and he says the essence of technology isn't anything technological. It's a mode of revealing. And it's a mode of revealing, right? That essentially what it does is it collapses distances, right? So the more
Hmm.
technological it is, the less time it takes, right? The less space it takes, the more instant it is, right? And so it collapses distances, right? And and once it started to get into social media, right? Like I think what started to happen is they removed much of the negativity of otherness, right? And you start to have these conversations that um, are just like basically everyone becomes the same in social media, right? There's no real encounter that
Yeah.
happens, and because you can basically still function, right, and never really have to have an actual conversation. All you need is an internet connection, right? You can basically like order all your food in. You could start a company, right? You could have a ton of like people in your like in your contact list, and like literally never have to talk to anybody. That's really possible now with an internet connection. It's really strange
Yeah.
how that's shaped up, right?
Yeah. And people go to war with each other on social media too. Like they don't
Yeah,
talk to each other, but they attack each other before
yeah,
they've gone through the various stages that you need to have an actual relationship.
yeah,
They
yeah,
go in either, admiration mode or kill mode, you know, like
yeah,
you're so beautiful
yeah.
and wonderful, or you're an asshole, you know.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. But no actual the in what Hans does a really good job of talking about is like how you start to eliminate the sense of other, right? And everything becomes just more of the same when you do that.
Yes.
And right, but when you think about the essence of like life, right, is this encounter with the otherness of nature, the otherness of others, right, the otherness of God, right, the otherness. It's this thing, this kind of, as William Desmond, who I just talked with a few days ago. He's up on my channel. That conversation talks about, human beings are we live out the between, the metaxu, right? And
Mhm.
therefore we always everything, right, is reliant and dependent on this otherness, and that otherness, right, is where we always dwell, right? And what makes an other is that like there's something communicated in that otherness that I can never make myself. I can never make my own subject. There's something that withdraws. There's always a mystery there. And but through that mystery is where the intimacy happens, right?
Beautiful. Yeah.
And I think that's the case relationally. I think that's the case ontologically. I think that's the case spiritually, right? I think, mysticism,
Mhm.
as you know, it's
So
like
mhm.
radical otherness, an encounter with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So the danger really is the smoothness that Hans talks about. It's kind of a false oneness, right? Everybody's sort of one, but then there isn't this kind of rough and tumble encounter with reality, which
Yeah.
is full of bruises, but also ecstatic possibilities.
Yeah. 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 Totally. Totally. This, I would say that one of the things, the way that circling has showed itself to me is that it's really had me recognize how fundamental, right, listening is, right? It's funny, we don't think about listening that much. In fact, when you go to most You go to Barnes and Nobles, like there's a whole section on communication, right? And most of those books, and there's a lot of really good books on communication, but most of them are really about what to say or how to say it or how to think about saying it, right? But a lot less, I notice a lot less attention is really on listening. But when you think about what listening is, it's really interesting. You start to realize like how primary it is for speech, right? Because speech makes no sense unless there's a listening, right? Like, and 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 therefore all speech is speaking into a listening and a
Hmm.
being drawn and required from listening at some level.
Yeah.
And you think about, well, how do you know about that there's a listening? Through listening, you hear it, right? And so speech fundamentally, right, arises out of listening and is 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 drawn into a listening.
Hmm.
Listening is the is like the it's like the womb, I think, of all communication, right? And so and that really like listening requires otherness, right?
Hmm. Yeah,
Like in
it's
that sense.
it's
Yeah.
it's a discipline to listen. I notice for myself because I tend to be blah 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 kind of person that I often have an idea and I want to interject it and I have to say something and so it's the discipline for me is holding back and not speaking and allowing for the full expression of the what the other person is saying to arise rather than getting into this kind of uh, boisterous kind of back and forth, which I like too. Like I like a
Yeah.
combative sort of feel. I think
Yeah.
there's different styles of listening and play. It's not just there's not just being a kind of passive receiver,
Totally.
listener but I mean the greatest. I was listening to Rick Rubin. He said that he was talking about how he kind of came across rap, right? And he just go into these places and listen to these guys, and he realized that the records they were putting out didn't sound anything like what was actually happening in the clubs. So
Yeah.
what he did was he just put it out like how it was. He just and that just like your circling movement became this global thing called rap, in a way.
Yeah.
Just from a guy who was kind of naively curious, listening to something and hearing something that there was
Yes.
a different, I think that's what it is to be. And there's something also about listening that is about curating reality. Um, like
Yeah.
you're hearing things and you're saying, does this resonate truly, or is this something I can throw away? And then when it's really going, then you're like in this incredible flow state where everything sort of resonates with reality. Um,
Yeah. Like, yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And it's also like when you think about listening, I think I kind of, I mean, most people just kind of like think about listening as something like just being kind of a receptacle or something, like being
yeah,
an empty receptacle, right? But if you really look at the phenomenology of listening, you, one way to get at this, if you notice, is like, as you're listening to me and say, like, something I says triggers a thought, and then you go with that thought. Like a minute or two later, you realize, oh shit, like I stopped listening, right?
mm,
I think that reveals something. Like it's almost impossible to listen and think at the same time. There's a like listening and thought, right, is deeply coupled. So in some sense, I think what
well,
listening
you
kind of
have to.
is, and
Sorry, I didn't listen. I interrupted you, but I think that's
yeah,
not exactly true because as we're listening, thoughts arise
yeah,
which respond to what you were
yeah,
saying, and we hold them
yeah,
back for when we're going to, because otherwise we wouldn't have anything to say. So we
yeah,
just have to be
totally.
more transparent and play this game of being transparent to the other person while also being transparent to ourselves. You know the saint
Yes, yeah,
Milarepa, he used to sing songs you show him he's got his hand on his ear because he's listening to himself sing
yeah,
songs like He's not, he's
Yeah.
listening to himself. So we are listening to
Yeah.
ourselves and the other person, and our
Yeah,
own
exactly.
thoughts and the other person's,
Well, I think it's like we could also look at it like this in a certain sense that when I really listen to you, in some sense, I am, your words are, and in some sense, your speech is and thinking me, right? Like it's
hmm,
not just receiving information like a kind of, I don't know, communication processing model or
yeah.
something. I'm actually giving you my thought for your words to think me in a certain sense, right?
Mhm.
So there's this deep way where it's not just like a passive receiving, it's a deep involvement in a certain sense, right? Like, and so like you think about listening at the deepest level, it's like very, very involved. It's like a certain kind of deep activity, right? That that one can really, really develop, I think, in a big way.
Mhm.
So I have to get going, my friend. This has
Very
been a
good.
really amazing conversation. Yeah,
It's been great. Yeah, huge pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for taking all this time and
totally.
and for
Now,
listening
can
to
I
me.
just say, like, if anybody's just interested in anything around circling, like, what's kind of cool is that we just start for the first time, I think, in circling, we created these self-study programs, right? So like, you don't have to like show up to a course or be live on, in 3D or on Zoom, and you can actually kind of study this on your own. And then we have all kinds of live courses and weekly events and weekends and year-long trainings. I'll give you all the links for that stuff afterwards. So if you're
Very
at
good.
all
Well,
interested in circling, I'll give you those links. Yeah,
yeah, I love the links. Thank you. And we'll send that out to our people. Um,
great.
okay. Have a good one, Guy. And
Yes, you too, my friend. Awesome
thanks so
being
much
with you.
again. I hope we can do it again. Yeah. Cheers.